Welcome to Leadtail TV. I'm your host, Bryan Kramer, keynote speaker, coach of coaches, and author of H2H Human to Human. Today's guest is Steve Mann, recently the CMO of Theta Ray. Steve has also worked in marketing, demand generation, and product strategy. People describe him as an out-of-the-box thinker that uses his positions to develop and mentor folks towards professional development, having also spent time as a VP at SAP and CMO of LexisNexis. In this episode, we talk about how things have changed from last year and how to focus now on a 3 and 6 month strategy in marketing. We'll also talk about a documentary style of branded content and how to bring bingeable content into brand storytelling. And finally, how do we create best practices and work within a crisis such as COVID? So let's get into it. Here's my interview with Steve Mann. So wonderful to be here with you. Thank you so much for joining.
It's my pleasure.
We are, so Steve, really cool stuff you've done in your career. We've been sitting here talking about some of that stuff even off camera, and I'm excited to bring some of this to light for everyone out there that's listening. And so why don't we just kick this off and just talk about your career and
Sure.
And what you've done throughout your career. You've worked with so many organizations to lead demand generation efforts. Curious, just to jump right in, how has your strategy or process changed since everything that you've learned over the last years of work in this area, and then as opposed to now in this past year, 6 months, 3 months to today, and what's going on?
For me, I started out learning about demand generation in the very classic sense that, tell them about your speeds and feeds and why it's good for them, and they'll buy your widget. And, what I came to realize is that the marketing that I was doing wasn't connecting with human beings. I couldn't understand why. I mean, they're logical. They, weigh rational arguments and make a decision. And isn't that what you do when you buy a widget? But the answer that I found was no. It turns out that's not true, that most of our decision-making is non-conscious. And so the work that I've done over the years to perfect my demand generation strategies and execution is to learn how to weave an emotional argument into a rational argument. 95% of our cognition is non-conscious, so can you imagine making a decision on your anti-money laundering software or your pair of jeans only by thinking about it rationally? No, it doesn't work that way. Both buying software as well as buying blue jeans are both emotional experiences as well as experiences of the heart. So that's number one in terms of my evolution, in terms of my demand generation strategies. Over the last year, I would say I've brought those strategies forward and, in a somewhat classic omni-channel way, really trying to inhabit the channels that my consumers are at, and really then optimizing those channels in order to drive towards my conversion goals. But I'd say over the past 6 months, that began to modulate. Over the first 6 months, I'd say the last 6 months, I'd say it's more about closing deals, right? So you're shifting away from your classic omni-channel model. You're making sure that you stood up and at all cylinders, your account-based marketing is cranking, and then you're really focused on that decision-making content within the buyer journey to get people to convert. But over the last 3 months, as we all know, we've got this pandemic thing going on. And so the messaging that I would normally utilize around customer acquisition or upsell was replaced with messaging that was largely around distraction, humor, nuance, rather than trying to be an acquisition engine, trying to be an engine for passivity and calm. Because it's been my experience that people haven't been very focused on making major purchase decisions right now. They're working to keep their jobs for sure, but I think folks are somewhat distracted. And that's really how my marketing has evolved over the last year and a half, at least.
It's so fascinating to see how fast this can shift and how demand gen can also lack some either gain or lack empathy. And I'm curious how you coach, counsel, create more of that in demand gen. I mean, it is a conversion point, but at some time, especially this time, it can also be tone deaf to what's going on. And how do you quickly enact and create from that?
It's difficult in the sense that some brands, it's not natural for them to speak in that way. And they have two choices: to keep speaking the way that they are, in which case their message is going to fall on deaf ears. And then there's a second option, which is to say nothing. And sometimes saying nothing, like my mother used to say to me, is better than saying something. So I think brands that don't have the wherewithal to actually make that shift in terms of having a heartfelt conversation with their customer base need to be quiet. As a matter of fact, by being quiet, it shows a tremendous amount of respect to your client base. Because if you look at your inbox, I know mine is just stuffed full of, here's what we're doing for COVID. Here's what we're doing for COVID. Here's what we did for COVID. I don't want to see COVID anymore. It's enough. I know where my life is right now. I know what's going on in my markets, and I know what I need to do to successfully re-enter my markets when we come out of here. So that's why I think being quiet, if you don't know how to have the conversation, is almost as good.
Ooh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I don't think I've heard that one before. And I tend to think, like, I just got a direct mail piece from a cruise line asking me about my next adventure, and
Mhm.
I often wonder, from obviously that's B2C, but no matter what, it really matters what you share, when you share, and how you share it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if I had gotten that type of offer, I probably would have said to them, "Yeah, I'd love to go on one of your cruises in my next life." It's like it's actually disturbing to me that at this point in time, these organizations are trying to rebuild their business. I understand the urgency and I understand how important it is, but I think they have to be very smart about it. And doing a broad-based blast to, I don't know how many thousands of people they've reached out to, is probably not the most effective means to regain their market.
Mm. So well said. So just kind of moving through this, I also want to talk to you about a few other things. I know on your CXO talk with our mutual good friend Michael Krigsman, amazing person, you recently talked about customer experience and brand marketing.
Yep.
What do you think about the efforts by companies like MailChimp and Wistia? Do you believe that their documentary style branded content and philosophies of bingeable content is working?
Mhm. So I'll qualify that answer first. I enjoy the documentary format. I think another reason is, number one, I think it's clever. And number two, and I like clever. I'm just attracted to clever. Number two, it's an easy way for me to consume that type of information. It resonates with me, and I also think it allows you. It's a great format for storytelling. That being said, there's a downside to this, in that you can invest a lot of money and you can create bingeable content that doesn't go anywhere, because although the consumer enjoys it, it's not the type of content that's going to drive conversion. So it's just like any other conversion mechanism. This type of tool, this type of offer needs to be tested. And I can't tell you whether or not they're testing this type of content. I know it's difficult because it's what you would consider a long form piece of content, but yeah, I think that is something that code needs to be cracked in order for somebody to say, you know what, I'm comfortable with this type of content strategy or not.
That is, I love that you called it out as non-converting, or at least not tracking conversion, because oftentimes we get stuck in,
Mhm.
even in the phase of trying to decide, is this worth it? And if there's no conversion at the end, how do you think that plays into decision making to begin that process of saying this is still worth it, even though we can't track the conversion?
Right. I mean, first of all, you have to have that hard conversation with yourself and your team, or you're going to drop 25, 30, $50,000 to create some form of some documentally format video without any experience that or data that says it's going to convert. But let's say you go ahead and you make that investment and you put it in market, and you've put it in market through multiple channels, which I would hope you'd be doing out of course. You're still going to be looking at each of those channels to see which of those channels are converting best, and then you're going to be optimizing them and shifting budget into the channels that are really moving well. But even within a given channel, you're going to be looking at which content within that channel, which conversation within that channel is actually working best. And so it may be that you find a channel, let's just say it's LinkedIn for giggles, and within that channel, a lot of your content's performing, but that documentary piece is not executing, it's not converting. Pull it, pull it.
Well, yeah, well said. I mean, it's knowing when to hold them and know when to walk away, right?
Exactly right.
And so, where do you see efforts like those of Mailchimp and Wistia with the bingeable content? Where do you see efforts like that going in the future? Is there any insights or thinking that you have around that?
Well, it's interesting that you ask, because if you think about that type of content, it's perfect for now. It's perfect in unsettled markets where the markets are maybe, moving a little bit this way or that way, and there is no direct, easily identified direction for a given market, which is exactly where we are right now. This is the type of uh, content that's very brand oriented. So because it's a great storytelling medium, I mentioned conversions from a demand perspective earlier. It may not be the best content for demand generation, but it is good content for brand building. And I've talked about well, what should you be doing? What should you be focusing on right now, given the current state of your markets? And I think brand building and revamping your customer experience is it's a perfect opportunity to do that.
Oh, that's it's such a these are such great conversations to have in the strategy phase. Do you see a lot of people, a lot of companies actually working their way through this and setting aside the time to measure and have those hard conversations along the way and really focus on whatever KPIs are working for them, and then and even just a debrief at the end on how did this run and should we do this again? Is that because it's kind of a new bingeable content is kind of it's not new to the consumer world, but to the business world, this is something quite new.
It is, but I've never been afraid of taking learnings from direct to consumer space and applying it to B2B. And I don't think I don't think any CMO or VP of marketing or demand gen should be as well. There's great learnings there. I think of my friend Margaret Malloy. She's the CMO of Siegel and Gale. And Margaret, has the unenviable position of really continuing to help drive revenue for the organization, as well as setting the right tone for the organization. And you think that was a single hat, but it's not. It's actually two hats, because they're so fundamentally different. You're shifting your messaging so dramatically to the general market, and then more nuanced to the folks that you're actively doing business with, because you don't want to miss the opportunity to have the conversation that they began with you. So there's that effort, and then there's the actual, the blocking and tackling of helping the organization close business and drive revenue to meet its quarterly nut. And Margaret does that superbly. She's one of the founders of the New York chapter of the Marketing Society. She actually invited me in, and I find that the things that she's taught me and other CMOs have taught me about how to do this, they really resonate with me, and they've really informed the way I like to go to market now.
Mm. I absolutely adore Margaret. She's such a wonderful person, and so anytime I hear her name, my face lights up.
Good.
Yeah, there's so much learning, and I'm really fascinated around how that information is being shared, and like you just said, how it's being created behind the scenes in these conversations. So it's really neat to bring that to life for everybody else to see. And I'd also like to get back to and talk about, well, I know that in email, in inboxes, we're being flooded with COVID-19. It's still a big topic.
Yeah.
Being that COVID-19 disrupted just about every industry out there. I know you've spoken a lot on your recent LinkedIn Lives about authenticity and emotion and brand marketing.
Yeah.
How do you think it's being affected by and shaped by COVID?
So I would begin that by saying that if you're talking about COVID as a brand, you're doing your market a disservice now. Your market has already been disruptive. So I prefer to think of it, and you mentioned it right out off the bat, that you're in a disrupted market. And the goal now is, what are you going to do moving forward? I think that any organization right now that is not talking about a disruptive market or COVID market, that's good. They should be focusing on nurturing relationships, informing, humoring, distracting, nothing more. It's Memorial Day weekend right now. And from a B2C perspective, what you'll see very little mention of COVID. What you're going to see is these organizations trying to get back to normal, which means, having your Memorial Day sales. And then there are organizations that still reference it, but aren't like in your face about it. A good example is Coursera. Coursera, they actually provide a free course via Johns Hopkins on contact tracing. Now, that's a great way to be connected to the thing that disrupted your market and then take advantage of it. And they're not taking advantage of it monetarily because it's a course that you can take for free. But they are taking advantage of it in terms of linking something that I care about, that concerns me, and they're providing a solution to give me a feel of more control over my life, which at the end of the day, that's what marketing's all about.
Oh, isn't that the truth? It's this whole thing about putting the customer at the center, and making sure that is the case. Have you come across organizations or look at organizations that aren't exactly putting the customer at the center with what you just said, especially right now?
Yeah, I think there are. The problem with putting a customer at the center of everything you do is that it's not just about marketing, it's the entire organization. Right? Everything within a customer-centric organization means that product marketing, for instance, is actually sitting deeply with customers to uncover their articulated needs, as well as, more importantly, their unarticulated needs from the solution that you provide. Services is doing the same. Services is there holding your hand, knowing what you need before you know it. The go-to-market teams speaking in your voice, in your customer's voice, and letting the customer drive their experience. So it would be easy for me to say, oh, this company is not doing it right. But in point of fact, it's got to be an entire organization that decides to be customer-centric. And then they go through the hard re-engineering to make the company be able to do that. So I can't answer your question directly because I don't believe that it's just this, it's one lever that you pull. It's virtually every lever in the organization that you have to pull to become customer-centric.
I would rather you not answer it directly and answer that exactly the way you just did, because that makes so much sense. I'm curious too, what learnings do you think then companies can take from all of this and should carry forward in from this crisis to the future of what now demand gen and marketing could and should be?
Yeah, the learning is that you never know when a market's going to get disruptive and that you need to be prepared ahead of time. We all know that in a given market, it goes through a maturation cycle, right? You've got new entrants that disrupt a prior market. They grow to a position of leadership. Then there are other entrants. The market gets crowded to the point where everybody's category leader, so nobody's a category leader. And all of a sudden, a new entrant comes in that disrupts that market by offering an alternative. And it's a new category. So we all understand that type of market disruption and we prepare for it because it's more of a long-term proposition. But here's a short-term dramatic change, disruption that nobody saw coming. So it's incumbent upon organizations, especially on the communication side, to discover that narrative, have that narrative in your back pocket, and revisit that narrative as often as you would say, revisit your your lead scoring model, to make sure that what you want to say and how you want to address it is still relevant, because this is going to happen again.
Mm, yes, and there's so much learning. I mean, I do hope that we all marketers, leaders, executives, HR, everyone sits down and says, okay, what can we take away, and how do we do that? I mean, I would imagine that those conversations are going to be more than just lunchroom conversations. That they're going to be actual strategy. I know you like the word strategic. So the actual strategy conversations around that, like how do we roundtable this and actually
Yeah.
make something of this?
And you can tell the companies that haven't done that, or you can see it in their approach to the way they're communicating to the market right now. It's the email after email after email that they mention COVID, but then they go right into their standard pitch. A company that I guess I shouldn't name in the ERP space, they are doing that on NPR every morning. These are upsetting times, so you need our solution. And every time I hear it, which is pretty much every morning because I listen to NPR every morning, I cringe it's a inauthentic way to take advantage of a very painful time.
So true. Yeah, that's that kind of there. There's certainly a positive way to approach things, and that kind of negativity or uh, conversation that's happening where you're scaring them into buying is not a tactic that I'm a fan of, or a conversation that needs to happen. And yet sometimes, as humans, we do like to go there.
Right.
That becomes our go-to, where we we see that as a challenge, not as an opportunity. Would you
Correct.
agree?
I would agree, and I would say to your point about scaring people into buying, emotions are part and parcel of how you're going to go to market. And so, if you think about fear, the lighter side of fear is focus and intensity, right? So if you can use messages that generate focus and intensity rather than fear, then you're doing right by emotions when you're market. Same thing goes with lust, right? The lighter side of lust is desire. I have a desire to be good. I have a desire to be seen in a great light by my CEO. I have a desire to create superior content and be recognized in the market. So it's good to use those emotions. They just have to be, you have to hit the right tone and use it at the right level, right? Or else it goes south and it doesn't work at all.
So last year, you wrote an article on LinkedIn about applying your budgeting strategies you use at home to budgeting at organizations. That's kind
Yes.
of cool. Hadn't thought about that. And so I'm curious, what are some of the other business related skills that you found transferable from raising triplets?
That's correct. So we have triplet girls, 3 girls. They're 13 years old. You can imagine that in my house right now, the only thing I want to do is I can move to the Caribbean and they can come visit me occasionally. It's a very girl centric. There's a lot of she touched me. That's my blouse. He likes me better than he likes you type of stuff going on. And so I've applied some very firm principles to try to address that. The first one is I've taken agile marketing and I've moved it into the notion of agile child rearing. In other words, I take the 3 kids, I lock them in a room, I have them solve that problem, and I just keep sliding pizzas under the door. And hopefully they won't solve it until they're about 17. Then I can let them out and everything will be calmer. The second thing that I do is around the dinner table, we have conference room protocols, right? So you need to talk, wait your turn. If you're late, you've got 3 minutes to get to the table or else there's a problem. So those types of disciplines in terms of having to manage a household with triplet girls, plus we have 3 more who are off the payroll, it can be challenging. So you need to bring a degree of executive functioning skills to the kids.
Oh wow, that is that I can't think of a better way to close out our time here today, that managing triplets, like you manage your business, or manage your business like you manage triplets, that almost that seems like maybe a touch more challenging than a CMO role. And so my hat's off to you
Much more.
take that on.
They're both labors of love, but one is enduring, the other one is not.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today and sharing all this great wisdom and wealth of knowledge. And I can't wait to see how it all ends up in 3 to 6 months, and for us to get back together and have those conversations.
I'd love that, Bryan. That'd be a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Take care.